Well, good morning. I am Corbb O'Connor. I am a blind, 6-foot-tall white Irishman with red hair wearing a super warm sweater because I live in Minnesota, and that means whether it's April, May, or July, we're prepared for anything. So excited to have you with us. My pronouns are he, him, and his, by the way, and encourage you as we have this discussion today to share yours along the way as well. I want to start with a quick lesson in Latin. It's also a little bit of an homage to my dad, who taught this to me, that the word educate comes from the Latin educere, which means to bring up or to draw forth, not to dump into. And so as we're having this discussion today, I want you to share your ideas and contributions in the chat. As you have questions, please put those into the Q&A. And I'm going to pause throughout so that we can take those questions as well as at the end. So don't feel like you need to hold on to those burning thoughts that you have, those contributions you want to have. It's a little bit goofy to have a discussion over a Zoom webinar with a few hundred people, but we're going to make it work together. So let's start by talking about this thing called the forgetting curve. And I'll show the graph in just a minute, but run back with me a couple hundred years to 1880, 1885. There's a man named Hermann Ebbinghaus. And he decided as a scientist to study memory. And so he started to think about what are some ways that we can test memory. And so while doing this experiment on himself, which today we'd probably say not very scientific, but he studied these nonsense syllables, these consonant, vowel, consonant words. So they mean nothing. So these are things like WID or ZOF. Those words he then would memorize and then test himself and see how well he remembered them. And later on, he would go on to see, well, what if I study them more often? How much time can I save in the second time that I go through these words? That sort of thing. But in the beginning, the point was just to plot the memory. And so he did so on something that we call the forgetting curve. And so we look at the bottom of time, we look on the y-axis at the percent accuracy or percent memory. We start in the top left corner, right? So at 0 time, we're at 100% memory. And then we go down at an exponential curve so that by the time that we're, a month out from things, we have remembered almost nothing of what we started with. And so this reminded me a little bit of genetics. So Gregor Mendel, as my freshman year high school biology teacher taught me, he studied plants, if you remember, right? What happens if I cross a tall plant with a short plant? What happens if I cross, those kinds of genetic combinations? And my biology teacher said, despite being the first guy to study genetics, he got incredibly lucky because his research actually held up. He happened to pick pairs that were on different chromosomes. So it worked, right? And that's about as much science as I'm going to go through today. Back to memory. What we saw in Ebbinghaus is that he also got lucky. So while we can debate exactly what shape this curve is and where all the points are, point remains that it is a well-established in science throughout 1885 all the way through today that curve generally holds true. So if we look at college students, right, in the first hour after they have learned a new topic, they're going to forget half of it. Within the first 24 hours, they'll forget 70%. Within a week, it's 80%. Within a month, it's 97% forgotten. So I fully expect that you have remembered almost nothing that I have shared so far, but nonetheless, the slides are online, so you're in luck. You can go back and study. Fact is, though, right, we're looking at this curve and we're saying, if we're going to study learning, if we're going to have e-learning about accessibility, then how do we break this curve? Because if 97% of what we teach is forgotten in a month, then we can only imagine how little is remembered after a year. This is maybe why HR people are right that we do need to take those HR trainings every year. Back to accessibility, how do we make sure that we actually get behavior change from the people that we are teaching? Ultimately, right, that's what we are looking for in this e-learning that we're providing. So these key points on forgetting that we've talked through, right? You're going to forget most of what you've learned. There are some things that you can do to make this a little bit easier on adults to remember, right? So we can say if the content is meaningful to somebody, they're going to remember more of it than if it's just kind of random factoids that you learn, right? I go to Caribou, I take their trivia every day. I don't remember most of it. Doesn't really have much meaning to me, though, by the way, honey never spoils, don't you know? But I love honey. Maybe that's why I remember it. But I also have some prior knowledge, right? I had some prior knowledge of honey because I love tea. Just like with accessibility, right? If we bring in somebody who has learned something about accessibility, like all of you, and we teach you a little bit more, you're likely to remember more of it. And then, of course, the complexity of the material matters as well. So if the material that I present to you is super dry and super complex and geeky, you'll remember less of it than if I try to be approachable in the way that I teach it to you. That's my goal. Let me know how we're doing. So today, here's our agenda. Let's talk about learning about the learners. Let's talk about how we mature our teaching methods. Let's also talk about how we break that forgetting curve, right? Some other ways that we can break that curve. And then what are some actions that we can take today that are going to make a meaningful difference for the training and the education that we're providing to each other, to our coworkers, and to our customers at the end of the day, and our consumers at the end of the day, the training that we're putting together starting today. So before I start, though, quick note of thanks to 3 individuals who have really given me a lot of what I have learned about e-learning. So Margie Howie is on our enablement team at Level Access, Brent on the team with Oklahoma Able Tech, and Michael Ambeck, former colleague at Site Improve. 3 fantastic instructional designers, 3 people who really know their craft and have been so gracious to share what they know with me along the way, and I really appreciate it. Because after all, I'm just an accessibility guy. I'm learning about learning. And when I approached these folks and said, hey, I want to, take some of the things I've learned and teach them, they said, well, do you know you are practicing one of the very core tenets of learning, and that is to teach others, you will remember better. So hooray, look, presenting at Oklahoma Tech Access Oklahoma is very selfish in nature. All right, let's talk about the learners that we're working with. So the learners that we are working with primarily with educational content, right? These are content creating leaders. So these are individuals who are going to be presenting, they're going to be creating documents, and at the end of the day, they are probably not the individuals who are going to geek out with us about what 1.4.3 means in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. Right? These are individuals who have a business goal, and they are creating lots of content. And of course, our number one thing that we try to encourage these folks to do is to make their content more accessible. Second thing that we know about these learners is that they are accessibility novices. Right? They are individuals who will take some level of accessibility education. They will then take some level of specifics about their job, but they're not going to go super deep, and they probably are always going to be in a learning state when it comes to accessibility. Actually, we're all in that learning state when it comes to accessibility. The third thing is they are measured by business outcomes. So at the end of the day, we have to remember that our learners are focused on a business outcome, not on the accessibility of their content. We are going to encourage them to try to keep the two at parity with each other, but we fully know that at the end of the day, the business outcome is going to outweigh the accessibility outcome. And that's just something we have to accept as fact. And we're going to try and push back and change and create processes and create ways to help them along. But at the end of the day, right, business comes first. And then the final piece, final core piece of our learners that we know as a whole is that these are folks searching for playbooks. They are looking for, give me the checklist. Tell me the 5 things I need to do to make my content more accessible. So these are the kinds of individuals who are focused very much on the tactical of how do I do this. We can tell them all about why it's important, why it matters. That's great. They're going to jump into that. But we have to also remember that the practical and tactical brilliance, Hamilton, Anyone? The practical and tactical part of this is really what they are going to be focused around. So let's jump into that second topic then. We know about our learner. How do we mature our teaching methods to better align? So, yes, thank you. The Hamilton sometimes just drops out. It's a little bit of Hamilaria. As anybody who's seen that video, you just drop into Hamilton in the middle of your sentences. Anyway, so let's talk about children and adults. So when we think about learning, I don't know about you, but for me, the first thing I think of is my 8-year-old kiddo, right? He's at school, hopefully learning something at this point. And so when we think about the way that children learn, they are motivated by curiosity. Picture your 4-year-old or a 4-year-old who's the best scientist, right? Mark Linenberger told me years ago that 4-year-olds are the best scientists because they always say, but why? But why? But why? Right? They're just curious individuals. And while all of us, I would like to think, are also curious learners, I mean, who watches the documentary at night, right? Like you watch it because it's interesting, and maybe because you reach the end of Netflix. But the point being, we learn because things are necessary to us. We're going to learn things that are interesting, but we are also going to really focus our learning on the things that are necessary to do our job on a daily basis. That's what we're going to focus on learning about and remembering, and that's ultimately what's going to motivate us to do that learning. The second piece is that the connections that children build are initial connections. So when my kiddo was first learning to get himself dressed in the morning, and he would listen to the Amazon device and ask what the weather was, and he'd hear that it was 40 degrees, he would not quite know what that meant, right? He was building a connection that what clothes make sense at 40 degrees versus what clothes make sense at 65 degrees. And then as adults, though, we are going to be drawing upon our life experiences. We know that at some point it was 40 degrees and we were out of laundry and we walked outside in a t-shirt and realized that maybe wasn't the best life choice. Or we didn't check the weather and there was an 80-degree hot spell in the middle of winter. And we walked outside in our winter coat and thought, that wasn't the best choice. We remember those things, no matter how specifically they might be or how thematic they might be. And that life experience then helps us to learn along the way. So when we add then accessibility learning into this, we are going to learn because we're curious, but we're really going to focus on the parts of this that are necessary for our jobs. The connections that we build with accessibility are going to be focused on our life experience on, oh, that's right. I remember creating that PowerPoint slide. I'm learning about how content in PowerPoint, the selection order matters. And man, I remember that slide that had 50 items on it. Well, that probably wasn't a great experience. But I remember also adding a lot of alternative text to that slide. And so now when I go back, I can add this idea of how do we add the selection order to our slides along the way. Our learning style as children is also one of those third things that's unknown to us, right? My kiddo doesn't know if he learns best by doing something, by listening to a lecture, by drawing pictures, or by jumping around and creating a play out of some concept he's learned. All of us on this call have some sense of what our learning style is. So me, for example, you are welcome to lecture me in a very dry way, and I will try my best to enjoy it. But I also know as I'm listening to that lecture, if it's something I want to remember, I'm going to start drawing something. I'm going to start writing notes. I'm going to take notes in such a way that it helps me to learn. I'm going to put that into practice in a way that I can learn best because my learning style that I know is developed and known to me. And then the final piece is about encoding. So that's how we actually take this memory and encode it into our psyche. Now, for those of you who are instructional designers, I am generalizing beyond belief at this point. So don't at me. But children encode based on physical characteristics. So think about it as they remember their toy based on the color, the shape, the sound. Adults think about encoding based on the semantics. So that's based on its meaning and its significance to us. So children, maybe they use like rote memorization and just repetition. And we're going to seek a deeper meaning and draw some connections along the way. So these are the four principal ways that learning is different from children and adults. So Why, Corb, does this matter? This matters because so often the e-learning that we produce about accessibility is written with the idea that children are the ones taking these courses. So we come into it and we think that people will want to know this small tenet of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They'll want to know all about color contrast because isn't everybody curious about color? No, they're curious about it only to the extent that it makes them do their job better, right? We come at e-learning and sometimes we say, well, we're going to help build connections on accessibility. And so that ends up with so many accessibility presentations, kind of repeating the same core part of WCAG at the beginning of every presentation because we think people are drawing initial connections. That said, we need to remember that our audience has some great life experience to bring, and that's ultimately what's going to help them remember. We can refresh their memory, and we should. So to be clear, there's a difference between saying, hey, dear learner, remember you learned these few things? Let me draw some connections now for you, as opposed to, I'm going to spend half of my presentation going through these basics and fundamentals that you already know and put a little dusting of powdered sugar and learning on top of this new content. The third piece, right, learning style, right, knowing that we need to have multimodal learning. We can't just have text or just have videos, or just have pictures because people are going to learn differently. They know how they're going to learn. They need to have some choice in how they choose how they learn. And then, of course, that final piece on encoding, right, making sure that we're creating that semantic meaning for adults, that we make things meaningful as opposed to, well, if I present it in red and blue, that's going to help people to remember it better. Speaking of which, red and blue, probably the worst two colors you could choose. Maybe red and green would be worse. But point being, you're using color alone. Let's avoid that. Christina talked about that yesterday. We'll move on. So learning is a lot like painting. So before you read the slide, I encourage you to step back for a second and think about a painting project. Now, if you are as much of a home maintenance person as me, which means I know how to put a maintenance request into the maintenance team in my building, let's think about painting a wall, for example, right? First thing that we all think about is like, well, we're gonna have to prepare the surface. We gotta prime it. So we're gonna sand it, we're gonna clean it, we're gonna put this primer down for something for this to adhere to, right? Then we're gonna add some scaffolding, right? Literal, maybe we're gonna create scaffolding so we can reach the wall, but also we're gonna add some scaffolding in such a way that we've created this foundation. So that's where we actually go out to the store, buy some primer, put that on the wall, and make that surface something that things can stick to. Third, application, right? Painting, we actually paint. And then the final piece, we reflect, right? Hopefully it's such a shiny, nice paint job that we literally can see a reflection, but also that we have some reflection on what did I learn from that experience? What went well? What should I do next time other than hire a painter? But hey, that's an important part of learning and reflection, right? But cleanup, right? Those kinds of things. So let's apply that to e-learning then. These are the 4 principles that so often are missing from accessibility e-learning. So priming, right? Preparing the learners to receive and process new information, right? You'll notice at the outset, I gave you an agenda of what we would be covering today. You have the slides ahead of time. You have content that is available to you to know that, oh, this is a presentation I might want to attend. I know the topic, I know the description. I'm starting to think about why am I interested in that? Then we activate that relevant prior knowledge and experience, right? You probably have some experience with children. All of you at some point were children. So maybe some of you still are, which is fantastic. But point being, right, we're activating that relevant prior knowledge that you have about learning before we talk about new ways of learning. Scaffolding, right? We build this strong foundation for adults returning to learning. Remember, a lot of us haven't been in school for a while. Some of us a lot longer than others. And so we need to remember how to teach people how to learn again. Right? What are some of the concepts that we're going to be teaching? What are some of the ways that we would encourage people to take notes or to participate in the, hey, raise your hand, ask questions, be in the chat. I see there's already some great conversation going in the chat. Keep it going. It won't upset me. And then along that way with scaffolding, along the way, right? I could give you some quizzes right now on some of the things we've covered. But why do that, right? You're still learning. You need some temporary support and some guidance at this point. as learners about learning. I also know that as we build that e-learning, we're going to have some level of assessment, absolutely. But along the way, rather than say, we've taught you about alternative text, now go write some, dear learner, to say, okay, as you write it, here are some things to keep in mind. Now go write. And later on in the assessment, maybe at the end of a course, I say, okay, let's test how much you have known and how much you've taken of your own notes. Now I'm going to take away some of those supports and see how you do along the way. That third piece of this learning process, this painting and learning process, is the application, right? Let's break down tasks and let's give very clear instructions and cues. Hopefully very straightforward. A lot of my friends have been diagnosed with ADHD, or attention deficit disorder, in the last couple of years. And I've learned a lot about breaking down tasks. So for me, someone says, go do laundry. I say, great, I know how to do laundry. Well, to my friends who have ADHD, a lot of times they could use a little more support. And so to them, doing laundry means, oh, that's right, I need to first go gather all my clothes. And they can't think about doing laundry yet. They're thinking about just gathering their clothes. And then once they're gathered, then they think about sorting. They don't think about doing laundry. They've broken it down into these tasks. We need to do that same thing with learners along the way. Can't jump right into the number one thing we want them to do. We need to break it down. We need to give very clear instructions and cues. Think about that content creating leader. Hey, thanks for your PowerPoint, CEO. Go make it accessible. Less helpful than, dear CEO, I noticed in your last PowerPoint that you did a really nice job adding this alternative text. When you add alternative text, could you instead do these things, right? And then we slowly add in things about other pieces of that accessible presentation. Final piece on this learning and painting is reflection. We need to offer this feedback and corrective guidance, and it needs to be timely as well, so that when we are teaching somebody a new concept, they have done some level of reflection. We need to then go back and make sure that we're reviewing those results with them in real time. We need to, whether that's a question that gets asked in the system shows them, well, you picked answer A. That makes sense because of these reasons, but here's why answer B was a better choice. And then the final piece on modeling the desired outcome, right? So instead of being able to just say, dear CEO, could you go make this accessible? Say, here's a really accessible PowerPoint that I just observed at TechAccess Oklahoma. And this Corbb guy did a really interesting, oops, not me. Pick someone else. Pick Christina from yesterday. Point being, right, we want to reflect and make sure that we have that model, that desired outcome, so that the learner has something to go back to and point along the way. Now, we hear a lot about gamification, right? Everybody wants to gamify everything. And I'm not talking about reasons that I, for some reason, despite taking Facebook off my home screen, keep coming back to Facebook because it's gamified and I want to see how many likes and how many times that little bell notification icon, how many numbers does it have next to it? There is a level of that as gamification, but I want to kind of wipe your mind clean of what it means to gamify something. So let's agree, let's not think about apps for a moment. And let's instead think about this idea of gamification. That's behavior changes when we enhance recall and motivate new action. Behavior changes when we enhance recall and motivate new action. So if I have learning, in order to get you to change your behavior, I have to enhance what you remember about the learning that you did. And I have to give you some level of motivation to do something different. It's very easy to just keep doing the same thing again and again. Why do I keep making pasta and pesto for dinner? Because it's easy and because I know where it is and I know that I can do it in 15 minutes. I would like to have something more interesting for dinner. It's going to take some practice and I need some motivation to get there. How do we motivate learners? I'm so glad you asked. 5, can't count. Maybe I need to go back and anyway, 5 key concepts here. So learning needs to be immersive and interactive. And we've got a picture on the screen here of a virtual reality headset. So think about the learning that we do. We need to separate the learner from their environment so that they really are immersed in that learning. We need to make it interactive. So if you have your email open, come back here. I'm going to make this learning so interesting and so immersive and so full of Hamilton comments that you're going to stay focused with me. Also make it interactive by saying, hey, talk to each other in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it, but at the same time, I want you to be talking with each other too. Well, thank you for the compliments, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. We also need to gamify by giving people some agency, some choice. Do you want to learn this concept in this way or in this way? Or better yet, pick the way you want to learn from all this menu of choices. You don't need to sit through a video of me explaining something for 30 minutes if that's not how you learn best. If you want to double speed that video or half speed that video, maybe you want to read a transcript. Maybe you'd rather read an article. Maybe you would rather learn all these concepts through infographics. All those things, right? We're going to present the material in lots of different ways. You choose what works best for you. It's one of the reasons that Zoom webinars make things very hard to learn. There's very little agency in a webinar. The third thing that we need to think about with gamification is challenging the learner with feedback. So we're going to present a challenge to the learner, and then we're going to give them some feedback about how they did in that challenge. That's super helpful because it's not just a rote, okay, we've taught you the 5 principles. Let me now ask you, which of these is not one of the 5 principles? Or which of these is the definition of this most specific principle? And they're all going to seem very similar and very close, right? It's not the point of learning to memorize definitions. Unless maybe you're a doctor, then maybe I do want you to memorize some definitions of what a particular prescription drug does. In accessibility, that's why I love accessibility. We don't have to worry about, people's lives in danger. We can challenge you with what is the practical application of this, and then give you some feedback on the answer. Now, competition, yes, okay. We should compete with one another, and we should have some prizes, and you should really do that survey at the end of this to make sure that you get one of those prizes from Tech Access Oklahoma. You should also be thinking in your learning about competition. How do we have learners who are taking this learning asynchronously compete with each other? Through a leaderboard, through points, through badges, through stuff they post on LinkedIn afterwards. Right? That competition drums up excitement and gets people excited then about taking that course or about remembering. And then the other piece too is about adjustable learning. We want to make sure that the learning can adjust to your level of expertise. Now, some people call this making learning more accessible. I guess that's the 6th principle, but it seems like if you're here, you recognize the value in accessible e-learning. Point being that accessibility of gamification, as you may sometimes hear about, or I like to refer to it as adjustable gamification, lets you then decide, do I want to take a really easy path through this course, or do I already know a lot about this? And now I want to do something that's a little higher level and more complex. So I have one course with multiple levels inside. So before we talk about breaking the forgetting curve, I want to pause here, and I'm going to jump to Adam here in just a second and see if there are any questions that we have in our Q&A section. And I would encourage all of you as well to drop some in if you have them. We'll answer a few now, and then we'll come back for more at the end.
Hey,
Adam, do you
Corbb.
have any? Yeah.
Yeah. So we just have one in the Q&A right now. If people want to go ahead and take a second and put some into the Q&A, that now would be the time to do that. But right now, the only thing in there is just a comment from Angela saying that they love the specific examples of how to provide feedback. Hello, CEO, you can make your slides more accessible by thinking about color contrast example.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Great. Well, please keep the Q&A going. Throw some questions in there. We'll make sure to address those, as well as keep the comments going, conversation going in the chat. Let's move then to how we break this forgetting curve. And in case you've forgotten, here's the forgetting curve, right? It's an exponential decrease in the amount of things we learn over time. Now, by the way, there is a little reminiscence bump that you can get in that curve if you were, say, go review your notes or review the presentation. But at the same time, you're going to remember more for a split second, and then it's going to trail right back off again. So how can we break the forgetting curve? Well, one of the ways we can do that is through micro-learning as a method of reinforcement. So if I personalize that micro-learning to you, you're more likely to follow through with it. So this micro-learning might take the idea that as you're doing a task, I'm going to pop up and say, hey, here's something to do, remember that learning, right? If you remember the days of Microsoft Office Clippy, Clippy was a great example of micro-learning. And now, as my friend Steve Jacobson says, Clippy has been replaced by got it buttons. Everywhere you see a dialogue, got it, and it never bothered me until someone pointed it out. You're welcome. Point being, right, Office is personalizing its recommendations to you based on the actions that you take. So if you frequently are somebody who clicks on an email and goes up into the ribbons and chooses 2 or 3 options from those ribbons to categorize it and to save it to a folder and mark it as flagged, Office is going to prompt you and say, hey, did you know you can create a keystroke and a rule to do all of that for you? Would you like to learn more? Right? It's a personalized way of micro-learning. Now, you could go take a course on how to automate your email inbox, but you could also just do it little bit by bit. What if, as well, this just-in-time learning, what if it was personalized to you based on the actions that you took in, say, an accessibility monitoring tool or in your content management system, right? These are the ways that we can start to bring in that accessibility learning in a more personalized way. So this just-in-time learning can also help us to learn best when there's that immediate problem to solve, right? I could go out and you could take a course on how to make your PowerPoint document or PowerPoint deck more accessible, or your Word document more accessible, or how to tag a PDF. But if you don't have a document or a PowerPoint to work on today, it may not be as valuable to you as if you have something in the moment to work on. Another piece is that we can provide that information and skills to somebody again and again through that just-in-time learning. And then the final piece is we can provide performance support. So things like job aids or checklists, or those things that the leaders are looking for, right? They're looking for that playbook. Here is your playbook, so that as you're making that PowerPoint more accessible, we pull out that document and it tells us, here are the 6 things you need to do. Starting with click the accessibility checker button and work through that list. As you have questions, come back and reference this document. Those kinds of job aids, those downloadable PDFs, are fantastic. The downside of so much e-learning is we give people all these things and we never have any great way for them to find them, other than we just expect them to download them. People do. Great, they're in my downloads folder. I feel like my downloads folder has kind of become like my mom's desktop. Like, she's got so many icons. Sometimes they start overlapping each other, but to her credit, she knows where every single one of those icons is. I feel like I live out of my downloads folder. But I'm a dork, as we learned from the beginning, a self-proclaimed nerd, as Lissa said. So, point being, we need to make sure that these job aids that we're providing, that we have a way for people to easily reference them and get back to them over time. So those are the ways that we make just-in-time learning more accessible, that we break that forgetting curve by providing that reinforcement through micro-learning. It's personalized. There's an immediate need to solve. We're providing that information and skill, and we're providing that performance support to somebody along the way. So this is all helpful, right? What can we do today that's going to make a difference? Now, I promised you in the description that we would include Malcolm Gladwell a little bit in this presentation. Malcolm Gladwell is an author. He's a former Washington Post journalist and now hosts such things as Revisionist History. He's got great audiobooks because he produces audiobooks like a podcast. But he has very strong opinions on things like golf and the LSAT, the law school admissions test. And I think that Malcolm Gladwell has an interesting point when it comes to the law school admissions test. So think of the LSAT, right? You want to go to law school, you have to take this test. And the test is studying things like your logical reasoning through games and puzzles and quizzes. And the assessment, though, is of your skills is supposed to say, are you going to be a successful law school student? Will you be a successful lawyer? what skills do you need as a lawyer? Well, you need somebody who's always going to be critically thinking, someone who will be empathic, somebody who's going to really understand all the nuances of a case and think about all the research they have to do to cross-reference all of the things together and say, well, what did we learn from this case and this case that applies to today's? And so in his podcast, Malcolm Gladwell has a quote from Justice Scalia. Scalia, former Supreme Court justice, is talking to students at American University, and one of them says, "Hey, how can I be, a good Supreme Court clerk? How do I get that job?" And he said, in essence, you go to American University. I don't hire students from American University. I hire students from Harvard. I hire students who do all these fantastic things, and they go to Harvard because I went to Harvard. Now, true or not, the fact remains that Malcolm Gladwell has a really interesting point about how we are connecting the assessment to what behavior we actually want to see. And so he says this in his podcast on revisionist history. A sitting Supreme Court justice is explaining to a group of law school students that he will not consider them for a job that involves being a tortoise, right? Somebody who's slow and steady, because they have failed to shine on a test that measures their ability to be a hare. So the hare, right, running quickly, doing this test very quickly, and they're getting through all those questions on the LSAT. And he's saying, no, you need to do the job of a clerk is to be a tortoise, to be somebody who studies and reviews and makes connections. But the assessment is different. Now, whatever your thoughts are on the LSAT and law school and lawyers, and I have immense respect for the way that lawyers think, there's an interesting connection here with e-learning. What are the things that we often assess in our e-learning that measures success with somebody's taking of our courses or of doing some kind of learning exercise? And what is the behavior that we actually want to see them do? So if the behavior is, we want you to produce a more accessible PowerPoint, we want you to produce a more accessible document, we want you to be more inclusive, then is an assessment asking about the nuances of a definition or a drag and drop exercise with 5 definitions of priming, scaffolding, application, reflection, and accessibility, does that really help somebody if they know the difference between priming and scaffolding? Now, if you're supposed to be an instructional designer, those may be key concepts to know. But if you are somebody who's wanting to make your e-learning more accessible, I wonder if that nuance really matters. And so as you leave today, I encourage you to think about how do you connect your assessment and your measure of progress to the person who's taken that training. A few other principles to leave with today. Remember about the assessing behavior we want to observe. That's what we just talked about. Remember that adults are selfish and they have lots of great life experience to share. And those life experiences help them to make connections. Children and adults have unique motivations, right? Curiosity versus need to know and connection to our daily work. Learning is like painting a wall, right? First we prime, then we scaffold, then we apply, and then we reflect on what we have learned, or in this case, painted, right? Gamification, not just for fun, not just for Facebook, right? It actually matters for learning. And then at the end of the day, remember that they're going to forget 70% of what you said within a week and 97% within a month. And so all you can really hope for is that they remember the 3% that is absolutely most critical. And so I encourage you in this moment to pause for a moment and think, what is, at the end of the day, in a month, when you've forgotten 97% of what you have learned, not just from this presentation, but from your time at this conference, what's the 3% you absolutely want to remember? And then use whatever strategies make sense for you to keep that applied in your day-to-day work and at the forefront of your mind, because you can't remember all 100%, right? Ebbinghaus couldn't do it in 1880. We're not going to be so successful today. But what we can do is say that 3% that's most important. Let's reflect on that often. Let's apply it. And let's together make e-learning more accessible and make e-learning better, because we're focused on that 3% that people actually are going to remember and use. thanks so much for your time today. I hope that we will stay in touch. I'm happy to take your questions in the Q&A box. We'll pause a little bit for that. And definitely, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks so much for joining.
All right. Thanks, Corb. Yeah, that was a great session. We've got just a little bit of housekeeping to do right before we jump into this Q&A. This is going to give folks a chance to go ahead and put those questions in there. As of right now, we only have a few. We're going to launch a poll at the end of each of these sessions before we start the Q&A portions. This question really helps us keep the lights on. It gives us some good reporting data that we use for some of our funding. It's a shameless plug, but you get to earn prizes if you if you participate. So every poll that you participate in will get you one entry into our prize packs that we will be selecting after the conference is all over, and we'll contact everybody and mail those all out after the fact. So anyway, with that being said, let's jump into the Q&A here. Anonymous asks two questions. First, are today's slides available online? Yes, definitely. The link to those slides has been put in chat a couple times. I will drop it in again right now. For anybody that needs those. And then a question for you, Corb. Can you define microlearning a bit more specifically, particularly as it relates to longer courses? For example, how do you incorporate microlearning into, say, a multi-module self-paced micro-credential or a 4-week hybrid learning design course?
Yeah, so micro learning is a pretty loose concept, and I'm going to invite our instructional designers who are listening in as well. Adam, Brent, please jump in and help me with this one as well. The way I view micro learning is it's learning that can be done in less than 5 minutes, and there's probably a far more technical definition that e-learning and instructional designers are familiar with. My view is it's something that can be done really quickly. And it's something that we can bring up in front of the learner on a recurring basis. So whatever tool or program that learner is using on a daily basis, how do we bring that content in front of them in their native workspace repeatedly? So for example, if you are always doing your e-learning in a learning management system, but you're always doing your daily work in Jira, then you don't have micro learning connected between those two platforms. But if we say pin a Jira ticket to the top of the story or the epic for today's work or this sprint's work, that's all about whatever that thing is that we're focused on in this sprint. So maybe we're doing a lot of accessibility cleanup and we want to, based on Christina's presentation, I'm picking on you yesterday, right? We want to really talk about encouraging people to tab through that content. Can they focus through it with a keyboard? As in that story, we might put a Jira ticket at the top that reminds folks what are the 5 things they need to think about as they tab through that. That could be a version of micro learning. And it can get far more complex, right? If I am somebody who can deeply integrate into that system and say, anytime there's a story that references this type of navigation, I want to have it hyperlinked and go to a card. That would be another way to do it. Guru is another type of system like that. Doing some fantastic work on accessibility, by the way. But Guru is a way of saying, how do I put a lot of content in a way that people can quickly search for it and find the equivalent of a digital note card of the key concepts they need to know? That might be another way to incorporate e-learning, where you give people access to a lot of that learning that's not just the hour-long webinar recordings and transcripts, but we break it up into those little note card size files that they can quickly search for in a browser extension. Brent or Adam, putting on the spot, anything you'd add on micro-learning?
Oh, I am not an instructional designer. That is not my area of expertise. Unfortunately, Brent is running our recording right now.
Oh,
so
all right. Okay.
He's not gonna be able to jump on. But if there's any
put him on the spot, nonetheless.
he's he's great. Let's see. It looks like we have in the chat, Nicole says that they're an instructional designer. Micro learning is a wonderful way to increase engagement. Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much else
That's okay.
to provide on that.
What other questions do we have?
Yeah, let's move on. Let's see. Angela has a comment. One of the trends to support educators already teaching in the profession is to earn micro-credentials in addition to their teaching certificate. The slide suggesting micro-learning, small chunks to enhance instruction aligns with this current trend. So that's good. Let's see. Question from Ali. What types of gamification do you recommend regarding reinforcing the 3%?
What types of gamification? So the pieces around gamification that really are helpful are competition, right? So how do we encourage people to compete with one another on this e-learning, not just set it and forget it and watch that video play and, oh, look, it says I was on that page for an hour, I learned, right? But really making sure that they're excited and engaged. That there's some kind of, reward or prize, always helpful. But then the other thing to be thinking about as well is what are some of the ways that we can make that course a choose your own adventure book? So it may be less technical than you might think, because all we're really doing is saying, at the end of page 1, dear learner, where do you want to go? Page 2, 3, or 4, right? They say, I want to go to page 3. Okay, great. Maybe 2, 3, and 4 to you and me as the instructional designer, it's the same content, it's just presented different ways. Maybe it's, okay, you want to learn about 3 first? No problem. Hey, now you've done 3, what do you want to learn? 2 or 4, right? And presenting those kinds of options. So we're presenting lots of choice, and we're encouraging people to make sure that they have the ability to challenge themselves, to get some of that feedback, and to compete with one another along the way.
Great. Anonymous asks, do you think you could reinforce longer term memory through like a self-fulfilling prophecy by asking people taking your instruction, what is the most important thing you plan to remember?
Well, I certainly tried here. So let's do a scientific experiment. Let's come back in a month and let me know. I think that absolutely helps though, right? Because, my dad tells the story. He went to a conference and he and his coworker sitting next to each other on the plane on the way back. They're reviewing their notes. And he had taken like 12 pages of notes. His co-author had taken 12 pages of notes. And she had been kind of writing some things down on a separate notepad. And at the end of the flight, she took her 12 pages of notes and said to the flight attendant, can you throw these away for me? And my dad said he almost like jumped out of his seat to dive for them, be like, you don't know what you're doing, right? And she said, look, I'm never going to read them anyway, right? All I really need are these key concepts. This is what I'm actually going to look at. I'm never going to read 12 pages of notes about that conference I went to. But what I will look at is this note card that I'm going to put on my computer screen that tells me for the next 3 months, what are the behaviors that I want to be doing differently. And then when I come to the conference next year, I'm going to get some new things and put a new note card on my computer and focus on those things for a few months and just constantly be evolving rather than focused on constantly memorizing and reviewing topics that may or may not have direct relevance.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's funny. Angela asks, what's the biggest area of need to make products more accessible?
What is the biggest area of need to make products more accessible? So I think that the number one thing that can be done is to bring in more individuals with disabilities into the development and design of products. So often there is a thought that, well, we can't bring people with disabilities in too early because we don't have a thing for their assistive technology to look at yet, right? It's all just drawn up wireframes. It's all pictures. And what I would say is, you're right, putting a flat printout in front of somebody who uses a screen reader may not be useful. But at the same time, it might also be that we could ask them, what are the ways that you would expect to access this information? What are some tools that you use on a regular basis that you like that are related to this? How would you want to, after you do this action A, what would you expect to happen? Okay, hey, in this wireframe that we've built, one of the things we're envisioning is when you click on this button, you get a pop-up. And in the pop-up, it tells you these things and you have these choices. Would that make sense to you, right? We're just taking that and instead of presenting it visually, we're presenting it through spoken word or through explanations of how assistive technology works. That's the first piece. The second piece I think that we can think about is prioritizing with headcount and budget makes products more accessible. So if accessibility is relegated to that thing that we should do at the end and put a little frosting on top of the cake, love frosting, but let's make sure that we also make the rest of the product more accessible. Let's make accessibility part of, the flower that goes into everything. Then that's going to make a difference as well at the end of the day for accessibility. When that team has the budget to go learn and to hire the experts, and they have the authority to make decisions that impact that product. So those are two things: people with disabilities and budget and headcount for accessibility work.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's so important. Okay, so we actually are at time. There are a few more questions in the chat. If we're going to go ahead and let people know that if they want to, they can go ahead and go take a break. Our next session will start up at 10 o'clock. But Corbb, if you'd like to hang around and finish answering these questions, I'll leave that up to you as well. I don't know if you need to.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer those.
Okay.
Either in the chat or in the Q&A box. We'll see how that works.
Yeah, they're in the Q&A, and I'll stay on and still ask them to you, but you just want to give everybody the opportunity to go take that break if they need it. So, okay. Next is a question from Holly. If I watch and listen to this recording every week, will I gain 3% more each time? This makes me think of a bigger presentation maybe should be followed by microlearning to reinforce.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I put in the chat that you're welcome to watch it that repeatedly, but the dad jokes are going to get really boring and you don't want to remember those.
Dad jokes never get boring.
That's right. I saw a question about where to get Guru. I'm putting that link into the chat right now.
Okay. Great.
It is
Great.
getguru.com.
Perfect. And then Anonymous asks, what's your opinion on artificial intelligence's role in microlearning? Are there any systems that use AI that you would recommend?
I am really late to the party on this. I started using ChatGPT like 4 days ago. And I will say, it's got some accessibility bugs that need to be ironed out, but it's not terrible. And I think that artificial intelligence does an interesting job of summarizing a lot of data together and giving you a starting point for learning. Where it, of course, falls apart is when you ask ChatGPT, can you give me the citation for whatever it just did? And it'll spit one out. And then I went and looked at the citation, and the thing that it claimed was in there was not. And I said, well, that statistic is not in there. And it was funny enough, it came back and it said, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Here's the other one. So, there's certainly a level of trusting, but verifying with maybe all caps. That's important to this. But the good news about it, I think, is that it gives people that quick access to some level of fundamental understanding of the topic. So if somebody says, hey, Corbb, I just started a new business in gap lending for real estate, I could ask him, what do you mean by gap lending in real estate? Or I could go ask ChatGPT, what's gap lending in real estate? And it gives me some level of understanding. And if we apply that then to accessibility, we can get some of that kind of quick summary information. But I don't think at all we're anywhere near replacing the work of the e-learning that we're providing to our teams and that we're building on a regular basis.
Yeah, for sure not. Hopefully, we've all still got jobs for a while yet.
That's right. Yep.
All right. And then the last question we have is from Joshua. Would creating a knowledge base with how-tos on specific tasks or concepts be an effective way to offer just-in-time learning for trainees to reference after training?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that two things though. One, the knowledge base, super helpful. Great start, right? Take this and kind of, if we think, what would my friends with ADHD, right? What would their approach be to this learning, right? Would they go sit through an hour webinar, or would they break it down into small tasks? I know for sure the successful individuals would break it into small tasks. So how can we break that learning in the knowledge base down into really bite-sized and maybe even morsel-sized chunks of information? But the second most important part for just-in-time learning is making sure that it is available to learners when they need it most. So whatever system they're in, How do we quickly make that work for them? And just saying, well, you go back to the knowledge base to find it. No, it's the icon in their Chrome bar that they can click on to quickly search. It's the Jira ticket that's at the top of the Epic that tells them the things they need to remember. It's the email that goes out on a weekly basis, or in our organization, it's the Tech Tip Tuesday from our cybersecurity team. Right? Those kinds of, that's the just-in-time learning that people are going to benefit from, is when it's really easy for them to find.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. Okay, well, that's all the questions that I've got in the Q&A.
Awesome.
So yeah, thanks again, Corb. The session was awesome, and we will see everybody back here in just a few minutes at 10 o'clock.
And a special thanks to our captioner and interpreters as well for today's session. And thanks, Lissa and Adam and Brent and team for the invitation. It's great to be with all of you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Bye, everybody.